There are so many reasons to buy a second-hand bike. The huge amount of money saved is a major one, but with the continuing constraints on availability, buying second-hand can make it that bit easier to find the model that you actually want. It's also better for the environment to use a bike someone no longer wants, rather than adding in yet more demand. But whilst the brand new box fresh bike only needs a little bit of adjustment to get you rolling, a second-hand bike does require that little bit more care and attention. So we've put together 5 things which we'd either check or replace on any second-hand bike. Let's get into them. You probably don't need us to tell you just how important functioning brakes are. The first thing to check is how much life is left in the pads. Whether they're rim brakes or disc brakes, chances are, even if you don't need to replace them immediately, you probably will in the near future. As a side note, if you've got disc brakes and they sound noisy or feel underpowered, that's a sure sign that they've been contaminated with oil. You can try sanding the surface off, or you can bake the oils out in the oven, but chances are you'll have to replace the pads. Just make sure to give the rotors a proper clean with specific disc brake cleaner or isopropyl alcohol before you fit the new ones. It's also worth checking the braking surfaces for wear, whether those are the rims or the rotors. These have a longer life than the pads, so you likely won't need to replace them, but it's certainly worth checking just in case. Finally, if your cable actuated brakes are feeling spongy or the lever won't spring back as quickly as it should, that's a sure sign that the brake cables and the outer housing need replacing. It's very much worth splashing out here. Getting some top level housing and cables will transform the braking performance, making them more powerful and easier to control. Now, they may be double or triple the price of some of the cheaper sets out there, but it still comes out to less than half a tank of petrol, and there aren't many upgrades of that magnitude that can be had for that kind of price. If it's hydraulic disc brakes that are feeling spongy, that's a sign that they do need to be bled. Now, if you haven't done this before, it can seem rather daunting, but in reality, it's as simple as a syringe full of oil through the brake lines. It is a lot cheaper to do yourself than taking it to a bike shop, so if money is a consideration, it's a skill worth taking up. To sum up, you probably do need to buy new pads for your second-hand bike, and there's a reasonable chance you'll need to either change the cables or give them a bleed. You probably won't need to replace the braking surfaces with new rotors or rims, but it is definitely worth checking. There are a few things in life more frustrating than a bike which doesn't shift gears properly. The first port of call should always be making sure that the cable tension is set correctly and then checking whether the neck hanger is aligned. Investing in what may seem like a big metal stick might feel like a bit of an extravagance, but really, they are so useful so often. If the gears still aren't shifting right, then you're probably going to have to replace the cables. Now, if your bike is sufficiently second-hand enough that you've got external cable routing, then this might be a job that takes you about 5 minutes per derailleur if you're practiced, or maybe 15 minutes per derailleur if it's your first time. If the bike has internal cable routing, depending on the model, it could take a professional mechanic hours to complete. Now, if you have the money, it might be worth saving your time here. If you're looking to save money though, then there are kits out there that you can buy to make the process a whole lot easier. Definitely worth the investment for the time saved. It's also worth getting a chain checker tool to see how worn your chain is, or you can use the time-honoured method of pulling the chain away from the chainring and seeing how far it will go. If you can see a lot of daylight, then it's too worn and needs to be replaced. Do bear in mind though, if the previous owner has been riding around on an extremely worn chain, they will have also accelerated the wear on the cassette and the chain rings to the point that the shifting could be even worse. Unfortunately, this means that you may end up needing to buy a new cassette and chain rings, but it's worth using this as an opportunity to consider your gearing. If you need something a little lower or easier, or if you wanted tighter spacing for more even changes in cadence. As chain rings are typically included when you buy a new crankset, this could even be an opportunity to change your crank arm length. So to sum up, adjust your gears, but also it's probably going to be worth buying some new cables and outer housing. And if you're doing your brakes at the same time, then it does make sense to buy these together. Do check your chain, but you're probably going to need to buy a new one, and just bear in mind that you might need a new cassette and new chain rings. As with buying any bike, it's pretty unlikely that the stock saddle is going to be a perfect fit for you. You might be selling your current bike to back finance the new second-hand one, in which case you can just swap the saddles over and save yourself the money. Otherwise, you'll be having to shell out for another saddle, which you know works for you. Now, new bar tape almost goes without saying. For something that can look and smell quite so bad and cost so relatively little to replace, it's amazing how many people go without, and how many people will splash out on new wheels whilst keeping the tape same for the entire season. As for your final contact point, you probably don't need reminding, but you're probably either going to need to swap in or buy new pedals. Now, we're coming to the upgrades, which can potentially be left for a little longer after the initial purchase of the bike. Definitely do check the tyres for heavy wear, but generally there will still be some life left in them. That said, a set of lightweight, fast-rolling tyres really does transform the feel of a bike in terms of the performance and also just keeping your consumable components refreshed. New tyres are a great investment. But even if you're not obsessed about speed, it's unlikely that the tyre spec will have the right balance of puncture protection or be optimised precisely for the terrain that you're riding. Should you wish, you could also take the opportunity to go tubeless. If the bike isn't already set up as such, you'd get the benefits of greater puncture protection, the ability to run lower pressures, and a decrease in rolling resistance and weight, although the technology does work best on those wider tyres. Finally, your bearings. Now, they do tend to last quite a long time, but equally, that means that it's an area that can get neglected. Now, we'll look at the bottom bracket first, which is the bearing which allows your cranks to spin, and will probably also protest the loudest if it's worn out, especially if the frame is designed for press-fit BB cups rather than threaded. It is worth noting that it is possible to get thread-fit bottom brackets for press-fit frames. Now, this consists of two parts that screw into each other, and this means that you don't need to hit them in and out of the frame, which makes maintenance a whole lot easier. Although you will need a specific BB tool to screw them in, as with any threaded system. And of course, you will need to get the current BB out in the first place. Now, a bike shop is usually best for that job. Your wheel bearings may need servicing, especially if you can wobble the wheel from side to side. On cheaper wheels and some select high-end ones, these tend to be cup and cone bearings. Now, to service them, you'll need some degreaser, some fresh lithium grease, and potentially some new ball bearings if the current ones are worn. It's a little fiddly and does require some specific spanners, but the tools are cheap, and once you've done it a few times, you do get a pretty good knack for it. Wheels with sealed cartridge bearings will need a specific bearing puller and a drift for slamming the new ones on. These kits tend to be rather expensive, and we wouldn't advise trying to bodge this. If in doubt, a bike shop is definitely best here. Finally, there's the headset bearings, which are the ones that allow your handlebars to move. These protest the least and don't have so much of a negative impact on your speed, so they are something that are often really neglected and can be really quite corroded by the time you get to replacing them. But it is very much worth doing, not least so that rusty grease doesn't keep seeping down your fork. To sum this one up, you'll know if your bottom bracket needs replacing, and if it's a press fit system, it is worth thinking about getting a thread fit system as a replacement. Wheel bearings need swapping if they wobble or they feel gritty when you spin them, and if they're cup and cone, that's great because they're cheap, but they are then fiddly to work on, whereas the sealed cartridge ones, although nice and easy to maintain, you do need some expensive tools. Headset bearings can get forgotten, so it's really worth checking them. If you're unsure, a bike shop is always your friend. To recap, in descending order of importance, check and replace the parts of your brakes, then do the same for your gears. Get the contact points, those being your saddle bars and pedals, set up as you prefer, then check the tyres and bearings for wear. They'll either need replacing immediately if so, or can be a nice little upgrade later down the line. So there we have it. If you've bought a second-hand bike recently, did you follow any of these tips, or do you have some of your own that you'd like to share? Do drop them down below. If you enjoyed the video, drop it a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and I'll see you again very soon.